Good morning, brothers. Today we are going to speak about Victor Hugo. He was born in 1802 and died in 1885, aged 83 years old. He was the third son of Leopold Sigebert Hugo and Sophie Trebuchet. He was born in Besançon in the French Republic, and his father was a French Republican. He was passionately favorable to Napoleon and regarded him as a national hero. Actually, he served as an officer in the Napoleonic army, and for this reason, he and his family had to move around quite often. So Victor Hugo spent part of his childhood in Spain, because you know that Napoleon also had some links with Spain. And instead, his mother was a Catholic royalist. You know that Republican and royalist, monarchy and republic are two systems that are completely incompatible. That sheds a lot of light into Victor Hugo's own political views. And in him we will find a long evolution. And he would go from being a conservative and a traditionalist and a Catholic and a monarchic person to practically the extreme opposite to the extreme opposite. Okay, so we would find these things converging into the figure and thought of Victor Hugo. After his mother and his father separated, he lived with his mother, and he maintained that not only sympathy but affection and leaning toward Catholicism and monarchic and the monarchy until 1848. So let's not get ahead of ourselves now. Let's see how things are going so far. When he was 20 years old, he published his first book. It was a book of poems. The title is Odes et Poésies diverses, which means odes and various poems. 1822. Then, in the next year, 1823, he published his first novel, Hans the Land, which means Hand of Islands of Iceland. His poetry was strongly influenced by the poetry of Chateaubriand, which is one of the most renowned representatives of French Romanticism. During this time, he also wrote plays, and then we find maybe his one of his most famous works from his youth, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was published in 1831. 1831. He was 28 years old, and the setting is the 15th century of Paris. This fits within the pattern of the historic novel that had been developed already in England by Walter Scott. Besides that, Notre Dame of Paris, the cathedral, becomes the setting, but not only the setting, almost a character in the play. And all of Paris is in it, from the king to the jokers and the jesters and the penniless people. So all of Paris is there, which of course leaves Victor Hugo also some room, and maybe way more than would be appropriate in a novel, but there's plenty of room for his moral and his philosophical reflection. While it's set in the 15th century, this is also a philosophical and a political reflection on the political thought of Charles X, who was the ruling king back then. So he's writing a reflection about French politics of the 19th century. Now, what catches your attention about this setting and this theme? Longing for the past, which is a common pattern of Romanticism. Yes, Romanticism. Another common element of Romanticism is Gothic. What style is Notre Dame of Paris? It's a Gothic cathedral. And even if in our days Gothic means dark and gloomy, there's a connection, because you can think of the gargoyles in Notre Dame of Paris that are grotesque, right? And there's that darkness, which is also a part of Gothic as they understood it back then. So there's that outlook toward the past. So this fits Victor Hugo within the molds of Romanticism, right? Now, is there any difference? Above all, he's concerned with the lower classes. So for him now, the main characters are the hunchback, who's a destitute. In his novel, he describes him very well. So on the top of my mind, it's not like I can make the whole description, but one of his eyes was closed and the other one was half closed with an eyebrow. And when they were going to scourge him, they took off his shirt and they saw that his chest was like that of a camel. So it's a very picturesque description of this outcast of society. And he's the main character. Besides him, Esmeralda, the Spanish gypsy girl, who in the end, spoiler, turns out not to be a Spanish gypsy girl, but she had been kidnapped by the gypsies. Anyway, that's another outcast of society that becomes one of the main characters. So Victor Hugo's concern with the lower classes indicates that we are turning into something new. What would be the new movement, both in literature and in music and in art? Realism. So in Victor Hugo, we find a late romantic that is already transitioning into realism. After this, he dedicates himself mostly to advocating for social justice. In 1841, he was admitted to the French Academy, which is quite an honor, especially for a young man like he was back then. He became very active in politics, both national, of course, above all national, but also international politics. For example, he was pleading for the life of Maximilian of Habsburg before Benito Juarez in Mexico. He also pleaded for the life of John Brown here in America. Both of those instances were for no avail, so then his pleas were useless. But it indicates how he was active in international politics, and he had a clear outlook of the way the world was going. He was also appointed as a member of the parliament. He advocated for human rights. However, he was also favorable to the conquest of Africa, to civilize its indigenous inhabitants. And he criticized France for lacking barbarity and strength in subduing the African tribes, especially those of Algeria. He kept silence before the atrocities that were committed during the French occupation, invasion, colonization of Algeria, which is not definitive because, for example, later on in his great work, Les Miserables, he would state that Algeria was too harshly treated. So you see that it's not like there are inconsistencies, or maybe there are inconsistencies, but above all, we see a transition in the way he thinks. For example, he never denounced slavery before 1843. So he was advocating for civil rights, but at the same time he was condoning, or at least he was silent about slavery. Then he became a harsh critical also of slavery. And on the one hand, you can see that there is Victor Hugo's personal intellectual journey and his transition. And that's something that you can study more in detail as you look into his works and the stage of his life. Okay? On the other hand, I think it's also very important, and that's my personal thought, but I think it's also very important to note who was in power. Because if he was favorable to the ruling power, maybe regardless of whatever they did in Algeria, he was going to condone it and exalt it and praise it. If he was critical of the government, regardless of what they did, he was going to criticize it. So we have to balance things and see that on the one hand we have Victor Hugo's own intellectual transition and evolution. On the other hand, of course, there's an agenda. So in whatever he says, there might be some hidden motive to criticize or to praise the ruling power in the government, especially in France, of course. 1848, he was appointed as a member of the National Assembly for the Second Republic. You know that the First Republic of France didn't live long, and it fell. But then they struggled to create the Second Republic, and they finally established it after the Revolution of 1848 against Louis Philippe of Orléans. Okay, that's history, you know it, or you should know it, or you will learn it. 1848, that revolution that instituted the Second Republic. Okay, and he was appointed as a member for the National Assembly in the Second Republic as a conservative. He changed his political orientation during this period. Okay, but let me ask you a very, very interesting, funny question. After you establish a republic, what's the first thing you do? Elections, right? The question is, who won those elections? The monarchic party. Exactly, yes, the monarchic party, which is a tragedy for any kind of republic. So the monarchic party won these elections. And who was appointed president? Louis Napoleon III. Okay. And he was president until 1851 because he was deposed in 1851. By whom? By himself. Yes, it was a coup to his own government. He overthrew his own government for what? To become emperor. To become emperor, and Victor Hugo was infuriated with this. He declared Louis Napoleon a traitor to the Republic, and Victor Hugo was compelled to go into exile, first to Belgium and then to the island of Jersey. Louis Napoleon tried to plead with the English government to extradite Victor Hugo, but since he was in the island of Jersey, they said, oh, no, that's an island, so it's not entirely our jurisdiction, and, you know, there were loopholes, so Victor Hugo was left alone in Jersey Island, and there he dedicated himself to writing, of course, his great work, Les Miserables, but I'm gonna get there in a while. He dedicated himself also to writing poetry. And he wrote also short treatise, which was a mockery of Louis Napoleon III, which is called Le Petit Napoléon, the little Napoleon. Because who was the great Napoleon? Napoleon Bonaparte, the grandfather of Louis Napoleon. And of course, Louis Napoleon was not favorable to this pamphlet that Victor Hugo had written. Actually, it was banned from the borders of France. Nevertheless, it was translated into many languages and it was smuggled into France. In addition, I've spoken about his poetry, and Émile Zola, the great French novelist, reflects about these times, and he recalls how during the government of Emperor Louis Napoleon III, reading Victor Hugo was in itself an act of protest. And some of Victor Hugo's works were banned because they were political, but most of them could not be banned because it was just poetry. So he was writing poetry about flowers and the seasons and the sky. So there was nothing political in that poetry, but people knew where it came from. And for them, reading the poetry of Victor Hugo under the reign of Louis Napoleon III was in itself an act of rebellion. Also, it is during this time when he finally published the novel he had been working on for 17 years, Les Miserables. He published it in 1862. It was an unprecedented success. Even before it was published, the Belgian, of course it was not going to be published in France, so it was published in Belgium. The Belgian publishing house orchestrated a marketing campaign that went 6 months before its publication. So when the novel finally came out, it sold in less than an hour. It was an unprecedented success. And it didn't come all at once. It came in 5 different volumes. So the first volume, Fantine, was striking its hold very well, as I said, in less than an hour. And it was harshly received by academic circles. So, for example, the novelist Flaubert and the poet Baudelaire didn't like it and criticized it very harshly, but nevertheless, no one can deny it was very popular. It was very popular, and people read it and devoured it. Maybe for this reason, let me read you what Victor Hugo writes in the preface of this great work. So long as there shall exist, by virtue of law and custom, decrees of damnation pronounced by society, artificially creating hells amidst the civilization of earth, and adding the element of human fate to divine destiny, so long as the 3 great problems of the century, the degradation of man through pauperism, the corruption of woman through hunger, the crippling of children through lack of light, and are unsolved, so long as social asphyxia is possible in any part of the world. In other words, and with a still wider significance, so long as ignorance and poverty exist on earth, books of the nature of Les Miserables cannot fail to be of use. That's what he wrote in the preface of Les Miserables in 1862. After his great novel, he also attempted some other political novels like L'Homme qui rit, The Man Who Laughs, 1869, which was not quite as successful as Les Miserables. And his last novel, published in 1874, with the same title, 1874, 93, dealt also with the reign of terror during the French Revolution, a theme that he had avoided for a while, but he finally tackled it. But of course, it's nothing to compare with the success of Les Miserables. In 1870, after the fall of Napoleon III in the Franco-Prussian War, he returned to France and was acclaimed as a hero. He expected they were going to appoint him dictator to institute the new government, but he was wrong. Then he promoted himself, and although they regarded him as a national hero, they didn't quite vote for him so much, so he didn't win the elections for the National Assembly, which doesn't mean he was not popular. He was popular. For example, for his 80th birthday, the largest parade ever took place in Paris. The Avenue Elliot, where he lived, was paraded, and its name was changed to Avenue Victor Hugo, and it goes all the way to Les Champs-Élysées. And shortly after this, he contracted pneumonia, and he died on the 22nd of March, aged 83 years old. The government awarded him with a state funeral, and in his testament he wrote, I leave 50,000 francs to the poor. I wish to be buried in their heiresses. I refuse funeral orations from all churches. I ask all souls to pray for me. I believe in God. So 5 quick sentences that state his testament and his final will. He was, and still is, but he was very influential for posterity. For example, great writers like Albert Camus would be very and profoundly touched by him. Same thing with Charles Dickens, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, whom he personally met. About his political views, he could be right in some regards, he could be very wrong and very, very mistaken in some other regards. For example, he's a harbinger, he's a precursor of the European Union, and he claimed that any war among Europeans was a civil war. All Europeans should be brothers. So you can see he might have been right in this regard. On the other hand, maybe he was too optimistic, because about the 20th century, which he didn't live to see, he said, in the 20th century, war will be dead. The scaffold will be dead. Hatred will be dead. Frontier boundaries will be dead. Dogmas will be dead. And man will live. He made a significant contribution to the Third Republic, and last time I checked, it's the longest French Republic ever. So I think that the Fifth Republic, which is the republic that we have today, still has like 80 or 17 years to outlive in its expand the Third Republic, because the Third Republic would survive the First World War. It would not survive the Second World War. So the Fourth Republic would be instituted after the Second World War, and it would fall in 1968 with Charles de Gaulle and all the movements of the 68. So today's republic has not outlived that Third Republic. But I will not get into politics, but I think it will outlive, unless something weird, very, very, very weird happens in international politics. He was a fanatic French patriot, and he declared himself to be so. For example, he wrote when he was 75. I am not one of these sweet-tempered old men. I am still exasperated and violent. I shout and I feel indignant and I cry, woe to anyone who harms France. I do declare, I will die a fanatic patriot. One of the strongest blows that Victor Hugo received during his lifetime was the death of his daughter, Leopoldine, who was aged only 19, and she was newlywed, and she and her husband died. They drowned in the river, and Victor Hugo received the news. He learned the news through the newspaper. And yeah, it was something devastating, and he hardly ever recovered from that. But that was not the only loss he would suffer, because he would see the death of a few more of his children. And as a common pattern, when one of his children died, he requested no priest or crucifix for their funerals, and he wanted the same dispositions to be observed for his own funeral. You can ask, well, why does he present such a benign figure of the priest in Les Miserables? It's a very benevolent figure, right? And to make it even more difficult to understand, why, when he was, at least in principle, still Roman Catholic, did he present Claude Frollo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, who is a bad clergy? I don't have the answer. You can reflect about that. But maybe I can give you two inklings into this question. First, maybe the praise of Bishop Bienvenu in the first 14 chapters of Les Miserables is a kind of criticism to priests, because he presents what they should be and what they are not. You can look at it from that perspective, and it might be an accurate reading. On the other hand, that's a personal view, he presents us with a priest that is very kind, very concerned, for his pastoral ministry, especially that of the poor, and who is intentionally not concerned with dogmas. So he might be presenting some kind of leaning toward some kind of deism. I don't think this would be the same as what Unamuno presents in his novel Manuel Bueno Mártir, the prototype of the atheist priest. That's a very harsh novel. The priest who is beloved by his parishioners, he does a lot of good deeds for them, he takes a lot of care for their spiritual and their temporal well-being, but he himself does not believe. That's a very harsh novel. And I wouldn't doubt that Unamuno was to some extent influenced by the Bishop of Les Miserables, but that's just a personal conjecture. It also reminds me of Father Panelou in The Plague by Albert Camus, and the discussions that the doctor, who's an atheist, and the priest, who's a believer, and how the priest thunders with apocalyptic claims from the pulpit during the plague, but then in the end he contracts the plague as well, and he dies. I wouldn't be surprised to find that someone has already drawn the connections between Monsignor Bienvenu in Les Miserables and Father Panelou in Albert Camus' The Plague, La Peste in Spanish. Okay, so in Victor Hugo we find some kind of deism like that of the French Illuminism, especially that of Voltaire. Voltaire was maybe one of the most anti-clerical personages who ever lived, but he was not an atheist, he was a deist. So he opposed institutions, he opposed dogma, he opposed hierarchy, he opposed the sacraments, but he believed in God. I think if we have to frame Victor Hugo's conceptions into some kind of mold, he would fit very well in the mold of Voltaire. Not only because of his beliefs in the first mover, but especially because of his harsh criticism against the Catholic Church in poems like Torquemada, published in 1869, The Pope, 1878, The End of Satan, 1886, published posthumously, and God, 1891. Yes. So there's a lot of poetry that Victor Hugo came up with. And I think that gives you a quite accurate view of his own personal evolution and the transition that he went through in his own personal lifetime. It also conveys a good image of how in Victor Hugo we find a transition from Romanticism to realism. And eventually we will see Tolstoy as well. If you find some scholar or some study that suggests that Tolstoy is a romantic, go for it. But notice that in Tolstoy, we don't find the main traits of Romanticism, and we find someone who is way more realistic than any romantic. So personally, I would frame Tolstoy within realism. Same thing with Dostoevsky and with Dickens. Legacy of Victor Hugo, I think I've spoken about it, but let me just mention one more thing. And Victor Hugo inspired over 100 operas. So there's more than 100 operas that have been inspired in the works of Victor Hugo. Of course, you know about movies, and you know about musicals, which, of course, the most famous one is precisely Les Miserables. So those marks speak very eloquently about the figure and the legacy of Victor Hugo. Okay, so definitely Victor Hugo stands as one of the highest ranking literary figures of all times. Thank you very much.